Moving along for the main event of the program. Obviously, it was the news a couple of days ago now that superstar Billy Graham passed away. He was 79 years old. He had been hospitalized for some time, and everybody had, been tweeting about it, and his wife had been given updates. And obviously, with all the health issues that he's had over his life over the last, 35 years, people got used to, well, he's in bad health and then he makes a comeback or whatever. But this one was longer and more severe, I think, than the others. And obviously, he didn't make it this time. But I mean, it's what everybody's going to say and already have said. They did a great package on WWE television. And for reasons that we will talk about, the Graham family has been intertwined with the McMahon family for the past, more than 60 years now. But so it's not any new ground, I guess, Brian, to say he was at one time the biggest box office attraction in the business. He was revolutionary and, inspiring or outright, basically being ripped off by everybody from Hulk Hogan and Dusty Rhodes on down. At the same time, I think a lot of people that, because of the modern video era, the younger people may not have seen as much. They've done the retrospectives on the WWE, did a DVD, and they've had plenty of stuff on the network. But maybe now more people are seeing the stuff from the 70s than have at least checked it out in the modern era because it's, being sent around. But do you tell me, do the modern fans, because of the 80s expansion, remember like basically the last run, what in WWF was 86, 87, the hip surgery, the whole 9 yards there? Is that what they remember, and they've just heard about the rest, or have they? What am I trying to say here? Does everybody know exactly how the fuck he got to be that big a star, that big a draw, when all they saw was the end of his career and the Crockett stuff in the mid 80s?
I think it depends on the fans' age. It depends on how much they dive into content. Like you said, if you grew up in the 80s, you saw Kung Fu Billy Graham, which some fans didn't even think was the real Billy Graham.
Yeah.
And then you got to see him when he got back into the tie-dye, but he was completely immobile. And I think he got hurt in his first WWF match back in 86. And then by 88, he was on commentary. And then that's when they did his first hip surgery, and they had footage of it on the show, which was kind of grisly for that time period of WWF. But it's interesting, though, when they showed on SmackDown, I think it was, the package for Billy Graham, they had the Hall of Fame from 2004 with Triple H giving the speech, because Triple H grew up a big superstar Billy Graham fan. New England kid, wanted to get into bodybuilding. That's what happens. And he said, Billy Graham was 20 years ahead of his time. And it's interesting hearing that about someone who, when you really think of it, was actually one of the biggest stars of the 70s. Not like someone who was uncovered years later, or someone who no one discovered, or like the Velvet Underground, like 8 people bought their record, but every one of them started a band. He was actually one of the biggest stars of the decade, but he still felt like he was ahead of his time because of the physique, because of the way of talking, because of the way of interacting with the TV. But he actually was one of the biggest stars of the 70s.
Well, he actually was only 6 years ahead of his time. Because if he had been the superstar Billy Graham of 1978 and 1984, Vince wouldn't have needed Hulk Hogan, because he would have already had superstar Graham. So because that was, I said we were going to talk about how the Graham family and the McMahon family were intertwined. It's kind of ironic that Vince ended up the first favorite wrestler that he ever had as a teenager, when he moved from his trailer in North Carolina and finally met Vince Sr., his real father, when he was, 15, was Dr. Jerry Graham. And his favorite wrestler, as he became an announcer, and if he had owned the company at the time that Billy Graham was champion, was superstar Billy Graham, the last gimmick brother of Dr. Jerry. And during that period of time, the one that Vince Sr. did the most business with was neither Jerry nor Billy, but was Eddie. And I think I think it's fascinating that the Grahams, in some way or another, were always figured in with the McMahon family, but if for different reasons and depending on Vince Sr. or Jr. But that was the reason, I think, why that not only did Dr. Jerry Graham get so many chances with Vince Sr. in the late 50s to through the mid 60s, but then Billy Graham got so many chances with Vince even after he retired. And I mean, because the last 35 years, if Vince Jr. was sending Billy Graham a check, and I'm not burying the guy's public knowledge, then Billy Graham was all for the WWF. And if he wasn't, then Billy Graham was saying these people are all possessed by demons and are, Satan walking the earth. And he legitimately, I guess he got so religious, he legitimately believes in like demon possession being an actual thing that happens. So but Vince would always, because it was Superstar, he would always take him back, just like to maybe a lesser extent, Vince Sr. would always take Dr. Jerry back because, well, it's fucking Dr. Jerry Graham. And Eddie was the only one who didn't cause anybody any trouble.
Except himself.
Well, exactly. But
it's interesting. I found not too long ago in the Wrestling News archives, going through the files, in the Superstar Billy Graham file is correspondence from Norm Keitzer to Billy Graham in, I want to say 79, that, talking about where the relationship was. Again, world champion 77, 78. In 79, Vince McMahon Sr. wouldn't allow Billy Graham to buy advertising space in the programs to advertise his poster.
Yes. And, that was the thing, is that he melted down over the title loss. And I mean, if you've read his book, and if anybody out there, if you've read the book, or I think it's still available on Amazon, but he melted down when Vince Sr. took the title off of him while he was still the biggest box office attraction in the business. And think about it, at that time, what were the 3 highest paying jobs in wrestling in 1978? The NWA champion, unless you were a promoter also, or a booker of own part of the office. I'm just talking about purely for wrestling. NWA champion, WWF champion, and Andre the Giant, not necessarily in that order. And he was the hit of the New York and the toast of the Northeast. And they were still selling the buildings out.
A better sellout ratio than anyone else in Garden history for wrestling.
Yes. And not more than Bruno, but a better percentage because, I mean, I don't want to get on side tracks here, but Bruno had a period where there was no TV in New York, blah, blah, blah. But Vince Sr. honored the commitment that he made to put the belt on him, but he honored the commitment he made to take it off of him. Remember, that was the story. He gave him his starting date where he was going to win it and the date he was going to drop it at the same time. And Graham was sure, with business like this, there's no way they're going to take this belt off of him. And they did. And
that can't be easy, because even if you're supposed to lose the title on a specific day a year later, as that year's happening and you're getting bigger and bigger and the sellouts just keep coming and people are paying a lot of money to see anyone beat you. Putski, Dusty, Mil Mascaras, someone. And then doesn't matter how good that year is. It ends at this date. I think even if you weren't Billy Graham, that would probably fuck with most people's minds.
Yeah. And the entire Graham family, and I have family in quotation marks because only Eddie and Mike were really related, but you guys know what we're talking about. They had problems at various points with substances, whether either alcohol or, in Dr. Jerry's case, alcohol and mental illness, Eddie with alcohol and Billy with drugs, both the steroids that damaged him, but also he got on drugs as a result of that title loss. And that was where Remember, I first saw him in 1979 in person because back in those days, he was the hit of the magazine covers and the pictures were phenomenal. And especially after the After magazines, the London publishing line, they liked belts, bodies, and blood. And Graham had definitely one in every picture, if not all three. And so he was on the covers. And, but it's the same. And you knew that he was selling out Madison Square Garden, but this was the days before home video. And there was no way, unless you took a trip to the fucking Northeast Territory or the guy came to your territory, you couldn't ever see him. So the only I'd seen brief glimpses. Remember, he had a scene with Wahoo strap match in The Wrestler in 1974, which was shot in 73 when he was on top for Vern. And, you couldn't really tell much from the movie scene. But then when they took the belt off of him, he dropped out of the business for a while and got fucked up mentally and et cetera, et cetera. And then, as I guess the entire instigation of this was Jerry Jarrett was creating the CWA world title because he couldn't get Lawler to run with either the NWA or the AWA title at that point, that he was going to make his own. And he wanted a legitimate world champion level guy to carry it, to give it the credibility. And obviously then it would go to Lawler. And then that's why when Lawler broke his leg after winning it, Jarrett brought Billy Robinson in because it's Billy Robinson. He could be a world champion. But Superstar Graham was the guy. And the problem was this was fall of 1979. So he'd been out of the business for a year. He hadn't been training hard. He wasn't real tan. He still had a great body. It was Billy Graham. But also think about this. He's come to Memphis, and I'm sure Jarrett probably made him a day. Billy, you won't make less than $200 a night or whatever it was, but it was nowhere near the money that he'd been making. And even, at the time, if he's in front of a crowd of 5, 6, 7,000 people, to him, that was like a spot show. And he was kind of defeated mentally. So he was a nice guy. But we didn't get the best superstar Billy Graham. It's not like he was motivated to tear the fucking house down every night, right? He was working sort of like Handsome Jimmy toward the end of the in-ring years. And at the same time, the Memphis fans, Tennessee fans didn't have the benefit of having seen him come in and get over in a territory in his prime, which was only fucking 3 years earlier, right? And get to talk every week on TV and the big push, blah, blah, blah. It was just kind of an abrupt thing. So that didn't work. And he was here when he dropped the belt to Lawler in Lexington on, I think, November 8th of 79. I'm sorry. And I think by the following January, I think he was gone. But it was, it was an example of context and time and place. And he had a different style than the Tennessee style. And but at least, I got to see him at that point.
Do you remember the first time you actually saw him in a magazine? Because there have been impressive physiques before then. Sailor Art Thomas may have had the most impressive natural physique ever, but he was another level, especially after he left LA. If you see those LA pictures, he's still kind of big and bulky, but then he got shredded. Do you remember when you first saw him in the magazines?
Yes, I do. And let's go back without going back to I was born in a poor child in a log cabin all the way back. Jerry Graham obviously was the first Graham. And we've talked about the Graham brothers, and they're going to be an episode of Dark Side of the Ring this season also. And I'm going to be on that because I did some research for that a few months back. But he was, mentally ill and an alcoholic and crazy. And he's the one that started the riot in Madison Square Garden in 57, where, we'll never know the real story. Everybody's dead, but possibly he got juice on Rocca when he wasn't supposed to, And potentially also Rocca didn't know till after it was over with either. And they had a fucking riot and almost got wrestling banned in the Garden, the front page newspapers. We've talked about it. And then he gets his brother Eddie, who the Grahams become, one of the biggest drawing heel teams in the history of the business at that point. And they're selling out New York and everywhere.
Not real brother,
not real brothers, but Eddie Gossett. But Eddie only can take Jerry Graham for a couple of years before he finally, when the run ends, he goes to Florida and ends up the top guy owning the territory, working with Vince Sr. for the next 25 years until Eddie died, or until 20 years till Vince Sr. died. And they had a close relationship between the Florida and the New York offices. But Jerry then got Crazy Luke in 64. And Eddie even came back to work some six-mans to kind of give Luke validity as a Graham brother. But that was a case of Vince Sr. bringing back Dr. Jerry after a few years. Let's try it. The Graham brothers again. It's the doctor. And he flamed out quick. But Luke Graham made a living off that gimmick for the next 20 years. Just being a Graham brother, being crazy. And believe me, I saw Luke Graham in the 70s and the 80s. Again, nice guy. Couldn't work a fucking lick. Awkward as shit, but he had the size, the gimmick, and the fucking promo. And then the last hurrah for Jerry trying to get back into business. This was after the hospital incident, which is chronicled in Behind the Curtain, my graphic novel, on sale now at jimcornette.com, where he stole his mother's body from the hospital at gunpoint in Arizona and beat up the orderlies and was taken in by the squad of police. He talks the Los Angeles office, Jerry does, into bringing him in because it's Dr. Jerry Graham, right? And he brings in a bodybuilder that is going to be his brother, Billy. And Wayne Coleman had broken in 6 months beforehand in Calgary.
Yeah.
And they trained him, and he was a bodybuilder. He had been an evangelist and a bodybuilder and did the traveling revival shows when he was like in his early 20s. So he knew show business and had the gift of gab.
How to work people.
How to work. Yes, exactly. And the fucking line of the patter, the promo. And then they trained him in Calgary briefly. And then Jerry, because they were both Jerry Graham was from Arizona also. So he got him booked in Los Angeles as his brother. And I have to think the reason why they chose Billy Graham was because I don't know if people around the world are aware of this, and probably a lot of people in the United States have forgotten now, but the biggest TV preacher in the entire United States was Billy Graham. He was on network TV. He did all the president's funerals and consulted with the high muckety mucks, the Reverend Billy Graham. He was a big fucking name. And so if you've been an evangelist and you're going to be a brother of a guy named Graham, why not be Billy? So in a roundabout way to answer the question about when did I first see him in the magazines, and we had to do the background there just so everybody knew the relation. The first magazine cover that I saw of him had to be it was a magazine from 1972 or no, 71, but I may have gotten it as a back issue in 72. But it's one of Bill's magazines, Apters, and the cover is "This Billy Graham Preaches Violence." And it's him in the fucking hippie fringe jacket that he used to wear in Los Angeles when he first got started. And that was cool, he's got Billy Graham's name, right? And then Superstar came in 72 from Jesus Christ Superstar when he went to the first place he did that was AWA working for Vern, right?
I think so, yeah.
Because he was obviously it was, and again in Los Angeles, I don't think Jerry lasted long again before something happened. but Billy was there as a single for a while and then, bopped around a bit and ended up working for Vern Gagne.
It is such an interesting move, though, just because, like you said, the Reverend Billy Graham was a pretty big figure in society. To take the name Billy Graham, of all the names you could have picked, to pick that one.
Yeah, and there probably was, I would think, some pushback at the time from some people like, wait a minute, can we do that? Because that's how puritanical or whatever it was then. And then, again, Superstar has a bunch of connotations, but if he'd have come out, if he'd have played the Jesus Christ Superstar music, he might have got run off television. But he gets his first name from a TV preacher and Superstar from the play about Jesus Christ. So he was reaching for the stars there. And
you talk about influence over the McMahons. I could be wrong. I believe WWE still holds the copyright on the term superstar for wrestlers, and Vince McMahon's love of using superstar instead of wrestler really all stems back to Billy Graham.
Yeah. And that's the thing is that, well, before we get to talk about what he influenced Hogan, when he goes to work for Vern, Dusty is there also. That's when Dusty was still there as a heel before he went to Florida, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, Dusty always had the lisp and the way he spoke. And I'm not saying that he just copied, but at the same time, Tawa Power, man of the hour, too sweet to be sour. That's Superstar. And you see all the pictures of Graham went to Florida in the late 70s when Dusty was there, and on top, the pictures of them with their arm around each other. Pictures of them with their arm around each other. Dusty brought Superstar to Crockett in '85 when he needed a job. Hogan saw the body, and so did Jesse Ventura, the body and the rap, the promo, the patter. But at the same time, Dusty saw that funky, jivey way of speaking too, and made some of it his. I'm not saying everybody just copied Billy Graham outright, although a number more people did. And as this can go to Austin Idol, and we can go on and on. But a lot of people took some certain thing from him and, made money with that.
It is funny, though, that we recently saw the Dusty Rhodes biography where Hulk Hogan said, I was in the crowd and I saw Dusty Rhodes and I said, that's what I want to be. And now here with the Billy Graham tribute video, it's the same thing. I was there, I saw Billy Graham, I said, that's what I want to be. Whoever they're interviewing Hogan about, that's who he wanted to be.
Well, and remember Flair, when he was starting out in the AWA, when Dusty was there as a heel and Graham was just coming in, he wanted to be Ramblin' Ricky Rhodes and be Dusty's little brother or whatever. But at the same time, you would also see some of Superstar in Flair and just the way he carried himself as a heel and etc. Anyway, the point being, when he went to work for Vern, that's where the magazine covers souped up. And also, think about this. He breaks in very early 1970 or late 69, one or the other, as a wrestler. By 72, 73, he's working for Vern Gagne in the AWA as a top heel. That's 3 years in. And he's already 30 years old because he started late. And the thing about Graham, and it fit Vern's territory, because Vern liked wrestling for himself and his opponents, Billy Robinson, Nick Bockwinkel, but he also liked the crazy gimmick guys, Crusher, Mad Dog Vachon, because that's what got over in the Midwest. And his baby faces and heels, Vern's, were some of the biggest names in the business that had drawn money everywhere, but there was no young people on the card. Ray Stevens at that point was 40, and Bockwinkel, and they were the bump guys, right? So when Graham comes in, he didn't need to take a lot of bumps, which was the only thing he never did, but he had a better body that nobody had seen, and it was a territory of promos. And he was a great promo even in that field. And he didn't mind bleeding. And they liked blood in the strap matches with Wahoo or the fucking grudge matches with Crusher or the saloon brawls. And he's got the look. And so he drew a ton of money there and was one of the guys figured in for Vern for a couple of years. And again, fit right into that big man or, talk him into building, gimmick match kind of territory that Vern did. That's another contrast with like a Tennessee territory or any Graham got over in Florida, but he was not the guy. He was one of an all-star lineup because the Southern territories that ran towns weekly, they expected more in the matches in the arenas, the house shows, more action, more bumps, more whatever. Because whereas in the Midwest and the Northeast, you saw every week on TV, you saw the top guys talking and beating some job guy up. And you only saw him once a month in the building actually having a main event match. In the Southern territories, you saw him in the building every week having a main event match. So they had to gear it up a little bit. But then again, did he go to Texas after Vern? He was down in Texas for a while. Then he was doing, at one point, he was doing Florida and the WWF at the same time.
That's right. Because again, he was in the WWF, what, a year and a half, 2 years before he ever got the belt. It wasn't like he just got there and got the belt.
Yeah, I think he went from Vern. He had a run on top in Texas and got to perfect more of that. Did a lot of the arm wrestling challenges, and then worked for Vince for quite some time, plus made shots in Florida. And then when he got the belt, it's another reason people, I guess now, maybe nobody talks about this anymore either, but the war between the NWA and the WWF that Vince Jr. would kick off, the only place besides, I think they did it once in St. Louis, didn't they? But no, they did it in Atlanta. The NWA champion versus the WWF champion took place in Florida. One of Eddie Graham's a couple of Eddie Graham's towns. I think they did Race and Graham in the Orange Bowl in Miami.
They called it the Super Bowl, didn't they?
The Super Bowl of wrestling. And of course they went 60 minutes, Broadway, I think, which had to be fun for Harley because that wasn't fucking Superstar's gig. I think they did one in Atlanta with Backlund and Race.
82. No, 82 they did Backlund and Flair.
Backlund and Flair.
I think it was July 4th, 82, and there's no footage of the match out there.
Flair probably burned it.
From what I understand, he may have wanted to. It wasn't a good match, everyone says.
Yeah. But they did several of those title versus title matches in the Florida territory, and they had a cooperative relationship. And then at the same time, they've just had on the Dusty biography and also on some of the Superstar clips, that was the big trilogy. In the Garden and elsewhere was Dusty versus Graham in '77 for the WWF title in the WWF. And Dusty was on loan from Eddie Graham for that. So there was a close working relationship there. But that's why, again, you look at Billy's career, he breaks in within a couple of years. He's a main event guy in a big territory. He's making money. I don't know if he made a lot of money in Dallas, but he didn't stay there long. He's in the WWF in Florida, both the biggest money geographic territory in the country at the time, and Florida, the home territory of not only some of the top talent, but also one of the most important promoters in the business. And he's being used. And then he wins the WWF championship. And he's the biggest box office attraction in the world. Or at least in the country. And by 1978, he's been in the business 8 years. He's done all that. They take the belt off of him, and he, like we talked about earlier, cracks up and just drops out.
And remember, Gorilla Monsoon in the Philadelphia newspaper, where he had a weekly column on wrestling, reported that Superstar Billy Graham died.
Yeah, died of cancer. And by the way, now, I have that newspaper article. It's in the vault. I saw it just the other day when I was looking at some other stuff. But I think that was the year, I think that was right after his Memphis run also. is Gorilla had fucking printed that. And because he did kind of disappear again after the thing in Memphis.
But then when he showed up in 82, all of a sudden, I mean, he was losing his hair, but now he's completely bald with a mustache and still in good shape, but a relatively good shape. Well, he's still in good shape.
Well,
but very different than what he once was. And actually, if you ever see footage of Billy Graham in 1982, he looks like 10 years older than he looked just a few years later.
Yes. Well, and see, that's the thing. By 1982, there were several things wrong. Number one, he was almost 40 now. So he had still in the karate gimmick, Kung Fu Billy Graham, he had the body of a 40-year-old guy that had been a incredible physiqued bodybuilder years earlier. And he still looked good for, I'm not saying I could have fucking beat him in a pose down, but he wasn't the guy that was doing, the pose downs with all the top bodies in the business a few years earlier. But also he's never been a guy that did a lot of bumps, took a lot of bumps, or had a lot of, he wasn't a smooth bodybuilder like Ricky Steamboat. Even when Steamboat ripped himself up for competition bodybuilding in the Carolinas at one point, he was still smooth as silk. Whereas Graham was not a smooth bodybuilder worker. It was the promo and the action and et cetera, et cetera. So now he's 40 and he's trying to do a karate gimmick because I think he mentioned it again in his book. He wanted to do something different. He had no confidence. He didn't think, he thought he had to do something different. I don't know what the fuck, but bald head, black handlebar mustache, black karate gi pants from the once tie-dyed, most colorful superstar in the fucking wrestling business. And Scott Steiner. There you go. My God, that was Scott Steiner in TNA with chainmail was Billy Graham from 30 years earlier.
So again, Philadelphia fans read in the newspaper that he died. Then they see him like this. He sounds the same, but he looks radically different. So some fans actually thought it was either a different guy or that the real guy died.
Yeah, basically fake Billy Graham. And Gorilla never would retract the deal, but the karate gimmick was horrible anyway. And that's where I'm saying now we're in the video era. And people who are trying to seek out home video that's not on the network that was passed around by the collectors or put on YouTube or whatever, now they're seeing karate Kung Fu Billy Graham, which was grisly horrible. And then I guess did he go straight from there? Was he out again for a while, but he ended up working for Crockett in late 84, early 85 when Dusty came in as Booker.
He was in Florida before that.
Okay. Which makes sense because Dusty was booking Florida.
Because I read something Sean Waltman put up there, which I thought was interesting because he's someone who actually did get into martial arts and became a big wrestling fan. Was a wrestling fan and became a wrestler, but that was the first Billy Graham he saw. He never saw the tie-dye Billy Graham. So to him, karate Billy Graham was cool because he never saw the other one. And
oh boy.
It's interesting. There are fans like that the first version of whatever you see, you think that's great, but if you've never seen the other stuff, what else do you have to judge it on?
Well, Kung Fu Billy Graham didn't sell out the Garden 28 fucking times in a row or whatever it was, but then to Crockett, to my point of where I was going with this was, that's where I'd obviously met him and talked to him as a photographer when he was in Tennessee briefly. I have pictures, etc. But now I'm in the locker room with superstar Billy Graham, and when he came back to the Carolinas for Crockett, at least he went back to the tie-dye. And he, like you said, he was losing his hair because now he just passed away. He was born in 43, so he was 42 years old now after multiple years of multiple steroids and other things. So he'd lost his hair. He was shaved, but he was jacked up again. And he had the bleached blonde beard, and had the do-rag on and the tie-dye and he had the talk and the patter. And so he was back to kind of being superstar Billy Graham. And in Crockett at that point, he didn't have to be the guy. He was a big star on, once again, another all-star roster where all the baby faces were popular and all the heels had heat. And that, fit in. And we did the thing with the Midnight Express against, first it was Jimmy Valiant and Rocky King. And Jimmy Valiant was representing the street people. And of course, Big Mama's cameo appearance there.
Woo, Boogeyman.
Oh, I've looked in bars, I've looked in cars, and here you are. And then Superstar Graham comes to the aid of poor Rocky King. So it's Superstar Billy Graham and Handsome Jimmy Valiant against the Midnight Express. And of course, Jimmy is my favorite wrestler from 1977 when he came into work for fucking Jarrett and did the program with Lawler. Woo, musty. And my Mama Cornette was actually named Handsome Jimmy Jr.'s official godmother when he was born, because that was while they were here in this territory. And so that's fun working with Handsome. And then there's Superstar Billy Graham, who, again, 6 years previously, or 7 years, that had been the biggest fucking star in the business. So, and Bobby and Dennis could take all the bumps because neither one of them were going to take any bumps. But it was fun to have those house show matches. And then I wrestled. Technically, I wrestled Superstar Billy Graham because we had a couple of 6-man tags at a couple of house shows where it was him and Handsome and Rocky King against me in the Midnight. And I believe the extent of our interaction was me getting in and choking him while he was down and maybe dropping an elbow. I'm pretty sure because Jimmy was actually at that point, Jimmy was one of the hottest babyface in the territory, so he always got the tag to make the comeback. But I've technically wrestled Superstar Billy Graham. So there you go.
Hey, Kung Fu Billy Graham, do you remember what his entrance music was?
Kung Fu Fighting.
Kung Fu Fighting.
Oh, ho, ho, ho. But yeah, again, that was, yeah. And then at that point, it was late 85, early 86. That's when he left Crockett. And, honestly, again, I can't say that a lot of people noticed he left Crockett, and it's not to be derogatory, but just because it was loaded, packed, the locker room of stars, and they were bringing in some more. And, Dusty liked Billy, but Billy was not a huge draw on his own in the Carolinas for that run. But that, I believe, was when it convinced Vince Jr. to, and see, again, that's the thing. If Vince Jr. in 1978 had been in the position he was in 1982, Graham would have never lost the belt. And for that matter, it's not like Vince had a sudden goddamn epiphany between 1978 and 1982. What he wanted to do, if he'd have been running the company 4 years previously, he would have started trying to expand then. May have been tougher because there wasn't anywhere near as much cable television. But that's the thing, whereas Vince Sr. wanted to go with Backlund. He didn't like having a heel on top. He wanted an all-American boy after all of the years of the ethnic heroes and the short-term heels. And he promised to go with Bob Backlund, and they still sold out. They still did great business because the company was on fire and they had the biggest towns in the country. So it's not like it hurt their business as much as it destroyed Graham's momentum and or psyche. But that was, whereas Vince Sr. tolerated Jerry Graham starting riots and all the trouble he caused because he drew money, and he gave him a couple of second chances because of that. Vince Sr. loved Jerry Graham as a personality because he was a teenage kid riding down the fucking streets of Manhattan in a bright red convertible Cadillac with this fucking maniac lighting cigars with $100 bills in 1958. But at the same time, Superstar, the youngest brother, would end up being the prototype 25 years later, right? Or more. Would end up being 20 years, whatever, would end up being the prototype for what Vince McMahon Jr. wanted to feature as the world champion in his plan to take over the world. And in the middle, the longest business relationship was between Vince Sr. and Eddie Graham, who both became two of the most powerful promoters in the business and had a relationship that at some points was even outside the parameters of the NWA. And then finally, Vince Jr. gets put back in the same position with Billy Graham that Vince Sr. was with Dr. Jerry at one time, in that he kept giving Billy Graham second chances and signing him as an ambassador. And, oh, it's the superstar, even though he said I was a demon possessed by the devil and put here by Satan himself to fucking, pollute the world. Let's send him a check.
That's the thing. He goes back to the WWF. Physically, he's unable to wrestle. They make him a manager for Don Morocco. They make him a commentator, and as good a promo as he was not a good commentator.
No.
And then at the end of '88, there was that house cleaning where all of a sudden, the Bulldogs left for different reasons, but Don Morocco, Ken Patera, Billy Graham, a lot of the guys who were really the stars of not the previous generation, but the previous era, I guess you could say.
The previous decade.
The previous decade, or guys that were coming into their own at the end of that decade and hit their peak early in the 80s. WWF was letting them go. And then it was '89 where Billy Graham starts going and talking about the dangers of steroids and all the health problems he's having. That's when we first started hearing that Billy Graham was, close to death. It was like in 1989. But it's interesting just because, I was thinking about this the other day. That's when all the Lyle Alzado stuff came out and he died and he got cancer and then he died and everyone attributed it to steroids. Not everyone, but it was attributed to steroids by many. And we all assumed because of that, because of Billy Graham talking about the issues he's having, that everyone who was a wrestler in the late 80s and early 90s, this was their future. And a lot of guys went too far with different things and paid the price, but by and large, you're not seeing that, which I think is really interesting. You're not seeing what Billy Graham said was going to happen to everyone in 1989, which is, all the wrestlers who took steroids in the 80s ending up physically like he did.
Well, there's a reason for that also that sometimes people overlook, is that he was taking those steroids in the 60s. And I'm pretty sure they probably refined some of them monkey hormones in that 20-year period. But remember, as I said, he was born in 1943. So when he got in the wrestling business, he was already 27. He was already a bodybuilder. That's where he met Schwarzenegger. And those guys, that early generation of bodybuilders and guys that were on the cover of all the weightlifting magazines, Dave Draper, I remember that was just almost cartoonly big in those 60s bodybuilding magazines. They were taking shit, that experimental shit, and or they had no frame of reference as to what the dosage might be, or cycling on and off or whatever. And Graham was kind of in wrestling, one of the, I'm not going to say the first, but one of the first wave of guys who were doing steroids, and they were more primitive and more unpurified or whatever. And there was no guidebook in a lot of cases to go by for what they were doing. That's why at one point, did Graham not get up to within 11 pounds of the world bench press record? Not for wrestlers, for anybody?
I'm not sure.
I think I heard that story at one point in his, whether it was the late 60s, early 70s, through the period of his athletic prime and when he was really big. But, I think that's the guys that were taking the stuff in the 80s. They didn't take it as long. They didn't take the kind of, prehistoric shit. I'm not saying it was good for him, but Graham he's had hip replacements and he's been in and out of the hospital for various issues and replacements and surgeries and everything since, like you said, almost 35 years. And that has to be playing somewhat of a part in this.
You would think. Again, we haven't seen a rash of people go down and just everything go down like it did in just a few years, it seemed like, for Billy Graham. And then after that, when the scandals in 91 and 92 happened, Billy Graham front and center. He accused Pat Patterson of stuff, which caused Pat Patterson, who had been his tag partner in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's right.
To never speak to Billy Graham ever again. Wouldn't accept an apology, nothing. Because he was really the main person. I shouldn't say that. He was someone most vocally, publicly.
He was someone that people would think would know the real story, and why would he lie, even though he was lying?
And when people were making accusations about Terry Garvin and Mel Phillips, I say accusations, I believe those stories are actually true.
Yeah.
There was Murray Hodgkin, who made an accusation against Pat Patterson. He was later proved to be a career con artist, but Billy Graham, in that mix, jumped in there to also point the finger at Pat Patterson. And, you know, that's the thing where it was, you couldn't tell how much of it was genuine anger or how much of it was, you guys fired me at the end of 88. I'm never going to let you forget it.
Well, and he didn't ever let him forget it, except when he forgot it, when they rehired him for various things. And that was the thing, is it seemed kind of sad. And I know that it's been a lot of years that he's been in ill health and obviously, you know, needed help at various points. But it was almost like clockwork. Whenever any deal or affiliation or whatever would expire, or they did something for him and the goodwill would wear off, then he would be back with they're all horrible and they're possessed by the devil. And that kind of became the thing where it would bounce back and forth. But I guess over the last however many years, they've been copacetic. Or were they? Were they on the outs again? Because he won the Hall of Fame. Did they fall out again?
They fell out again after the Hall of Fame, for sure. I remember seeing.
But then did they fall back in again after that?
That would have been something recent, because I remember seeing some stuff online just a few years ago. Like, people got upset at him for saying that Adam Cole should get on steroids. Which, again, even if you think Adam Cole should be bigger, if one of the main things about your life is your body breaking down because of the steroids you were on, don't tell someone else to get on them.
Yeah.
But he was still out there, and I don't think, based on what I read, that he was necessarily in their camp at the moment.
Okay, but and that's
before he openly got sick again. I don't know if that changed anything.
Well, and they still paid tribute to him, and you know, that's the thing. Vince has the soft spot there because he was superstar. Billy Graham was what Vince wanted to main event his worldwide company with, and he just didn't get to do the company in time, or Graham was already too old and didn't make it long enough.
You know what, though? Can I say this, not to take anything away from superstar Billy Graham, but that was probably the best thing for Vince McMahon, because Hulk Hogan, personality-wise, was the right guy for that spot for Vince McMahon.
Yeah.
I don't know if Billy Graham would have been able to have a 5-year run as the champion, as the main babyface, working a schedule. Even though Hogan didn't work necessarily the full schedule that everyone worked, just constantly on the run, constantly going. If you have substance abuse issues, you know, I mean, that's the time where they're going to really pop up. So I think, all things considered, Billy Graham may have been the inspiration, but he probably wouldn't have been the right guy in the role for the long term.
Oh, I agree with that 100%. He would have got the spot, but at the same time, if he got it in 78, it like you said, it wouldn't have worked out as well. But also, there was no Hulk Hogan in 1978. But if he was the same superstar Graham, he would have drawn huge for the first couple of years, and again, especially in the Northeast. But over a longer period of time, he wasn't not the wrestler, but he wasn't the employee that Hogan would be, to go the extra mile, to do to want to get into movies, to do all the other thing. I don't think he would have been able to handle that like Hogan did.
No, and again, perfect guy for Vince McMahon. Hogan hears that Ventura is going to start a union, and he goes and tells Vince, I don't know if Billy Graham would have reacted the same way if he was the top star.
Billy Graham would have said, hey, Jesse, when can I be the first one to sign up?
Can I bring in Ernie and Ivan to talk to everyone about what we did?
Yes, yeah. Oh, that's another thing. We've talked about it before, but when Graham and Ivan Koloff and Ernie Ladd were the top 3 heels in Vince Sr.'s WWF territory, they negotiated a deal where they would all three walk unless all three of them got main event pay, no matter which one of them was in the title match on top or whatever, they got paid the same thing because they were rotating them in and out against Bruno Bruno was champion at that point. And they felt that they had all worked together to get the territory business doing that. So even if one guy was on top one night, all three of them would get the main event money. So that was a pretty fucking good deal.
And in terms of, you brought up before, there were so many superstar Billy Graham not impersonators, but he inspired so many to the way the Road Warriors inspired so many people.
Right.
You know, Jesse Ventura being Jesse the Body Ventura, very similar to Billy Graham in terms of not really being a guy in the ring that could, you know, go the way, you know, someone else may be able to go.
Yeah, actually, they had kind of a Superstar was a little more mobile in his younger days than Jesse, but it kind of the same kind of thing.
But Jesse Ventura, you brought up Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan said that Dusty Rhodes and Billy Graham were his inspirations for getting into the business, and the Billy Graham influence is obvious. But it's really another Billy Graham influenced wrestler, Austin Idol, who Hogan took so much from when he went to Minnesota and started changing the promos. It wasn't Idolmania anymore, it was Hulkamania.
Yeah.
Another person influenced by the look and the style of Billy Graham.
And, you know, again, the body was new, but the bleach blonde heel in the Northeast especially goes back to the Graham brothers, Jerry and Eddie, and to the Fargos, Jackie and Don. And to the, Shire brothers also were doing at the time, Ray Stevens and Roy Shire. But the addition of the body and the physique would not only, it grabbed people's attention in those days because most of the guys weren't built like that. And to be honest, in the 70s, when I was a hardcore fan, smart fan, whatever, you didn't want to see the bodybuilders because they were usually the shits, right? Their matches weren't any good. The body looked
Zulu.
good. And
yeah, you had just seen Zulu. Yeah.
Yes. And the boys, even into the early 80s, the boys in the locker room most of the time would roll their eyes when a guy with a body came in the locker room because they're, shit, here's another one we got to work with. He's going to be stiff and fucking hurt me and whatever. And it wasn't until Vince just made it necessary that you have to have that kind of physique to get a decent job in the business that the boys even wanted to work with a guy with a physique, much less have one themselves, because it not only wasn't necessary, but it hampered, in a lot of cases, the guy's ability to fucking work. And in the territory days, who had time to go to the gym that often? You were in the car fucking 8 hours a day. So, but then, but that was the vision that Vince had, and Billy Graham fit it perfectly.
Well, he certainly did, and Superstar Billy Graham, people will still remember him and talk about him. There's a biography, as you mentioned before. WWE has produced a documentary in the past, and a lot of those promos are out there. The local promos are really what you want to try to find, but those promos are out there, and a big influence on wrestling. I'm sure that influence will continue.
And as well, we'll see them profiled, I think, in 3 or 4 weeks or whatever coming up on. Well, we'll talk about it next week when we have Evan on for Dark Side of the Ring, the entire Graham family.
The entire Graham family, meaning not just Eddie and Mike, but Dr. Jerry and even Billy?
Jerry, Eddie, Mike, Billy, and occasionally Luke.
Oh, even Luke? Wow.
He's probably going to be, I mean, they've only got an hour, so he's going to be the Zeppo of the piece. But, it is the Graham family, but with some emphasis on modern day. But I have reason to believe, unless it doesn't make the final cut, they will reenact the scene of Jerry Graham stealing his mother's corpse. So we got that going for us. But anyway, Superstar Billy Graham. So there you have it. 79 years old, and most people have been thinking it was going to be, bad for the last, as we said, 20 or 25 years. He's been in ill health. So he was a fighter till the end. But you can't take anything away from the legacy or the the impact that he had on this business. And as we saw, as we just talked about, in a relatively short period of time.
Did you ever see that footage? I know you're not a big fan of the garden shows from the late 70s, but it's a clip that now has gone around again. It's Billy Graham versus Ivan Putski, and it's the build-up to the Polish Hammer.
Yes.
And he hits it. Those people wanted to see Billy Graham lose so badly. They explode in the garden like nothing you've ever heard.
Yes, that was the thing is they had never seen a heel champion in New York City. The top singles champion had not been a heel for more than 3 weeks in anybody's lifetime. Think about that, because I guess Rogers was he was a heel.
That was it. Yeah, that was really it. And he was briefly the champion because of everything happening between his injuries and the politics.
Yeah, that the thing is, they didn't even use a singles world title in the Northeast when Rocca was on top. He wasn't a champion. He was just the star. They didn't have a singles title until Rogers was the NWA champion and Vince Sr. was trying to steal him and the belt came along with it. But that was just for a less than 2-year period. And then they took the belt off Buddy, and then he had the heart trouble. So since the 30s, all the champions had been baby faces. And now the people have this fucking guy that, like you said, Mascaras can't take him, and Bruno can't win the rematch, and Putski can't stop him, and Chief J Strongbow, and whoever Dusty. They stole the title from Dusty in the Garden, but he couldn't take it away from Superstar. So, yeah, it got to the point where any time that anybody looked like they had a chance, the people would come unglued. And that it was not showing signs of slowing down. And then in comes, and I love Bob Backlund. He's a great guy. He's a heck of a person. But most of the fans, they liked him for the first couple years, as we've talked about. Hardcore fans hated him because he was namby-pamby goody two-shoes. And he just didn't work compared to the colorful personalities that they had before and after in that spot.
No. And again, you watch those local promos and you have Billy Graham and the Grand Wizard, two incredibly flamboyant personalities. And then you get Bob Backlund with Arnold Skaaland, and Vince asks him a question. And he's just, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to be working as hard as I can. It's a weird promo, but it worked. Like you said, whatever you want to say, it worked for the first few years. By 82, by Snuka, Backlund was losing the fans and also cut his hair, started wearing a singlet.
Yeah.
Found a way to make himself unappealing to what the changing wrestling world was becoming.
But again, can you imagine Billy Graham looking over at Bob Backlund saying, look at me and look at him, and he wants to put the belt on this guy?